Welcome to Georgette Chen at Home in the World. My name is Sammy Shan and I'm one of the co-curators of this exhibition together with Tsai Heng, Lim Shu Chen and Teo Hui Min. So this is the first museum retrospective of Chen in more than 20 years, and we're building upon the good work that has been done in the 1987 National Museum of Singapore retrospective as well as the 1997 Singapore Art Museum retrospective. So please follow me. We've chosen to start this exhibition in the Nanyang Period rather than take a chronological approach. And the reason is that this is really the period that many people associate Chen's works with and where she made her most emblematic pieces. Behind me, you see these three works that we've chosen because we really feel that they are signature pieces that shows Chen's command of the local idiom as well as the use of local colors. Looking at this work, Malay Wedding, we can see that she's really chosen to take a scene that most Singaporeans are well familiar with and paint it in really bright and vibrant colors. You can see that the composition is quite unique and interesting in that she's chosen to use the bunga manga, which is a kind of celebratory decoration that is frequently seen at these weddings, and it echoes the shape of the palm trees in a very festive and joyous way. Now, this scene was actually painted at just outside Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts where Chen was teaching, and she really saw it as a way to depict something that was very typical of Singaporean life at the time. The way that she's depicted the local colors in terms of the clothing of the figures who are attending the wedding, as well as how they balance against the colors of the shop houses and the clouds in the sky are really very beautiful, and this is really a key work for this particular exhibition. Singapore Waterfront is another work that you may have seen before in our previous galleries. It's a very small and sweet piece and almost jewel-like in a way that it's been conceived. This format is almost square and the composition is quite unique in the sense that you can see the horizon far away as well as the shoreline close by. And the way that she has composed this painting is that even though the sky takes up a large amount of space here, our eye is drawn to the water and the way that these very broken brush strokes capture the sunlight shining upon the surface of this glittering port and harbour. The way that she's pictured these two figures, like a hawker as well as a boatman, really give a joyous sense of life by the river, but also in a kind of peaceful and tranquil way. In keeping with the Malaya theme for this early part of the exhibition, here behind me you see four works that appeared in Chen's 1953 exhibition, The Chinese Chamber of Commerce. This was sponsored by the China Society and really marked Chen's entrance into society in Singapore and also introduction to the art community. These works represent a kind of range of her practice, both in the Nanyang area as well as her previous places that she went to, and you can see the very well-known self-portrait, of course, as well as a beach scene that she painted in Penang called Batu Ferringhi, and these two landscapes, one which was painted in Ipoh, Malaysia, another one which is quite a postcard-like scene of Zion National Park in Utah. Drawing your attention to Batu Ferringhi, if you have a look at the sand and the way that she's rendered it, you'll find many similarities with the way that the water has been rendered in Singapore Waterfront, which we just looked at before. So you see once again the broken brushstrokes, the way that she's really used luminous color to draw out textures on the ground and really portray how the sun looks like when it's shining through the trees. And of course, these ubiquitous kind of coconut trees that you see everywhere in these like coastal landscapes. This is really also a very beautiful piece where she's played with the notion of the horizon and the foreground and shown a sliver of water that's in between the main focus of the work, which is the sand. Now, this showcase occupies a prominent place in our gallery, and the reason being is that the archival materials that we found during the course of our research is very, very important in the way that we've conceived and contextualized Chen's life. We found a real rich amount of material, and the number of works that we have, in fact, number about 74, which is almost about the same, if not more, than the number of paintings that we have in the show. So what we've tried to do consistently throughout the exhibition is to use sight lines between what you see in the archival showcases as well as the paintings in front and behind of you to really suggest that the materials, to suggest how these materials shed light upon the way that Chen made her paintings and developed her practice. So even though Chen's arrival in Singapore in 1953 was extremely emblematic and was the start of where this, this whole story, it was not the first time she came to Singapore. She came to Singapore in 1932 first with her husband Eugene Chen as part of a diplomatic journey that they were taking for Eugene's work around the world. You'll see here a very important letter that Chen wrote, and it's written in French and it's addressed to her friends. Of course, Chen being very far away from the places that she lived in before, which include China, France, and the US, correspondence was a very important part of the way that she kept in touch with everyone. And fortunately for us, these letters all survive, both the letters that she received as well as those that she sent, and they form the basis of much of our research about her life as well as her practice. So in this letter, she very vividly describes her impressions of Nanyang, and she says things like, "Everything here inspires me, the fruits with their unexpected forms that intrigue me, and that she forgets their names as soon as they're taught because they're so exotic to her. The colors are so warm, the fragrance is so real and vibrant." And it's really a picture of her very strong impressions upon coming to this region, and it was really a new experience for her. So Chen's arrival in 1953 was important not just for the solo exhibition that she mounted and brought her great success and recognition, but also because it allowed her to meet many people in the art scene who she was introduced to and found valuable allies amongst them for her time in Singapore. So one of these people was Mr. Lim Hakka, who was the founding principal of the Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts, and he offered her a job which she took up and used as part-time work to supplement her painting practice. So here you see some photographs of that fateful meeting in the Botanic Gardens, as well as those welcome tea that was hosted for her. And you can see that people really turned out in full force to welcome this very well-known artist who had so much exhibition experience overseas, including France as well as the US. And over here you see as well a continuation of the kind of attention that her visit excited, and this included newspapers in the English and Chinese media that talked about her solo show, as well as showed some highlights from this exhibition. The cover for this particular exhibition catalogue was here. Sadly, this painting is now no longer with us, but we believe that these add a vivid sense to the kind of excitement that her exhibition and her visit generated. So of course, Chen was known for her emblematic landscapes that she made of Singapore, and many of these were captured as part of her work. And here you see 4 very iconic ones that include well-known Singapore River, a favorite subject of many artists, as well as some places of worship like temples, and also how life looked at that time, which was like, sometimes it occurred in kampongs and small dwellings and so on. This work, Boats and Old Shop Houses, is one of the many paintings that Chen made of the Singapore River. It's also called Lifeline of Singapore, which we know because we saw a painting label on the back of the painting that indicated this. Now, you may find that the point of view of this painting is quite unique because it seems that the artist is standing on a part of the shore that's not naturally accessible. But we know from her letters that she actually rented a room in the nearby YWCA, and she spent a few days sitting there painting the scene through the window, which is why you can see a rather unique kind of top-down approach that really surveys the scene and captures the most critical aspects of this bustling part of the river that include the boats as well as the shop houses behind that were used for business and commerce, and also included many vehicles that are contemporaneous to that time, including this Morris Minor, which she herself drove. So this very colorful scene with the use of many pinks and greens as well as blues really capture the vivacity and the light of this entire scene. This large work, Satay Boy, was composed in a really interesting way. It may look like it's taking place outdoors, but what happened in actuality was that Chen spent a lot of time constructing this elaborate scene. So the props that you see that the subjects are kind of manipulating were commissioned by her with a local carpenter. And the people in this painting are actually students that she got to help pose with her. So she composed this scene over several weeks and spent a lot of time painting it. And what she wanted to do was really to capture perhaps a typical scene that a person might come across, in a kind of daily trek around Singapore, where people are enjoying food in a very pleasant outdoor setting. These props that you see here actually still survive, and the curators came across them in the Heritage Conservation Center when we were doing our research. So what we have left are this kind of like structure that shows the cooking scene, as well as that kind of staff that you see below, and some of the fans, and as well as the hat. So it's really interesting to find these relics from Chen's life and connect them to actual paintings that we have within our national collection.
For Chen, portrait painting also provided an interesting opportunity to capture the cultural diversity as well as richness of the people she encountered while she was in Malaya. And this is very clear through her attention to detail in the accessories as well as in the costumes of her different sitters. In this painting, Family Portrait, we see a very close-knit family group. They're sitting together, relaxing, as well as enjoying each other's company. This was a family that Georgette Chen knew while she was in Penang in the early 1950s. The family, the Chen family, of no relationship to Chen herself, were very close friends and neighbors to Chen. They maintained a close correspondence throughout the years. So we can see definitely the empathy and also understanding that Chen had for this in her sort of approach to painting this group. This painting was actually painted over the course of almost 2 years because Chen visited the family on multiple occasions and took the opportunity to paint each of the sitters individually and then combining them into this complete painting. This is a portrait of Rohani Ismail. Rohani Ismail was one of Chen's students while she was a teacher at the Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts. The two of them maintained a close relationship even after Rohani graduated. Rohani Ismail herself went on to continue practicing art and was a member of APAT, or the Angkatan Pelukis Aneka Daya, the Association of Malay Artists. Even though she was juggling with her own various family responsibilities, Rohani still professed through her letters to Chen her passion for her art. In this portrait, we can see not only Chen's fine attention to detail in depicting her friend, but also her interest in decorative elements, such as the very detailed patterning of her baju. Still lifes was another important genre of painting within Georgette Chen's oeuvre. Just like portrait painting and landscape painting, still life painting was something that Georgette learned while she was a student in formal academies in Paris as well as New York. Still life painting for Chen, particularly after she arrived in Malaya, was a very important and exciting way for her to express her wonderment and interest in the new and interesting tropical fruits that she found around her. This particular painting depicts one of Georgette Chen's favorite fruits, the rambutan. In fact, in letters that she wrote to her friends, she even called herself a rambutan specialist, which gives you a sense of her sense of humor as well. In this painting, we see that even though she's painting just one subject, the rambutan, she has taken great pains to actually depict it in multiple different ways and in multiple different angles. We see in the painting the rambutan going through different stages of ripeness compared to the one on the table as well as in the basket. We see the peeled shells of the rambutan on the glass tabletop, which also reflects the contents of the painting. In the middle of the composition, we see a very delicate porcelain bowl within which lies the translucent forms of the rambutan fruit itself. In this painting and composition, it really expresses Chen's expertise in meticulously detailed way of painting the subjects around her, as well as a very unique approach to color, which we can see in the very attractive green and blue tones she's used in this painting. This painting of tropical fruits is one of the largest still life paintings that Chen completed after her arrival in Malaya. In this work, we can see Chen adopting different interesting perspectives into one single composition. When we look at the rambutan basket on the left, we see it as if it was on a table in front of us. However, when we look at the basket, which contains a pineapple and some melons, we see almost a top-down perspective where we are allowed to look into the basket. This is coupled with a very interesting angled perspective of the distinctive red-colored bananas. So we can see that even though Chen, very painstakingly, painted still lifes and went about collecting different types of fruit for compositions, each time it was with almost like a challenge to herself to find new ways through which to depict these very simple and ordinary subjects. Besides painting still lifes of fruits and flowers that she found around her, one other subject that Chen found herself continually drawn to throughout her life was the humble lotus, as she called it. This painting, Lotus Symphony, on loan to us from Long Museum in Shanghai, is one of the only works that Chen painted in this very unique panoramic format. Painted in 1962, during a school holiday when Chen was off work as a teacher at the Nanyang Academy of Fine Art, she went to a friend's garden where she set herself up in front of a lotus pond for 10 days and painted every day from 7 a.m. until the late evening. So we really get a sense of Chen's observational finesse through this painting. As our eyes lead across the painting, we start to see the sinuous forms of the lotus almost as if they were in a breeze. If we look closer, we find small details like a fly on one of the lotus flowers, and also get a sense of the reflection on the pond's surface.
Archival materials is a key part of this exhibition. So these materials amplify Chen's contributions to the artistic community and also shed more light on her role as a teacher and mentor to many students in Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts. So here, what we see here is the first message that Georgette Chen wrote to her students in 1957. So Chen will continue to write annual messages to her students, and in these messages, she will often provide advice on what an artist should be and also her inspiration on what art is. She will also give advice to her students, telling them the realities of being a professional artist, as some of them may continue to do so. So here we also have a really rare photo of Georgette Chen in the classroom, her smiling and posing in front of an easel, and together we can see her with a student, Mr. Lee Sik-kun, from whom we borrowed this image from. So the next section that we'll look into is really Chen's support of the arts community and the acknowledgement that her role actually helped the community at a point in time. So for her support of the arts community, she was awarded the Pinga Apat Award, which was a predecessor of the Cultural Medallion as well. So in this section, we see 3 artworks that demonstrate Chen's penchant for traveling. So Chen loved to travel, and this was something that she carried on from her time in France and China as well. So when she came over to Malaya and subsequently settled in Singapore, she also made regular trips to KL, Penang, and in 1960, she made an important trip to the east coast of Malaysia, and these are the 3 artworks that came about as a result of this trip. So let's just take a closer look at one of them. Here you see the bustling market activity in Terengganu. Chen depicted this painting when she was in east coast of Malaysia in 1960. So this trip is significant because for the first time, you see Chen use a multi-figured composition to depict her subject matter and the reality she sees before her. Here you can also see Chen's confident use of colors that is blended harmoniously in this painting. This comprehensive timeline chronicles Chen's life as well as her artistic practice. Here, we map out her movements as well as her solo experience against key historical events and geographies as well. So in 1994, the estate of Georgette Chen donated 53 artworks to the National Collection. So currently, the gallery is the custodian of the largest institutional collection of Chen's work, and we currently have 106 artworks in the collection. So not only do we have a substantial amount of her artworks, we also have a large body of archival materials that enables us to understand her practice more.
Okay, we are now in the second gallery for Georgette Chen at Home in the World. And this really represents the early period of her practice, with the works mostly dating from 1930 to around the late 1940s. Now, if you look at the subject matter of the works, including the landscapes, the kinds of still lifes that she painted, as well as the people that she painted, you'll see that it really reflects her very international kind of conditions in which she traveled around the world and painted everywhere that she went. And because she was born in 1906, and of course she lived through very complicated times, including 2 Chinese revolutions, specifically the ones of 1911 and 1949, as well as 2 world wars, you kind of see that the archival material in this section really reflects this complicated time period. It's not always seen in a painting, sometimes it is, but we have used archival materials to really contextualize the paintings in relation to this very tumultuous period in life. Okay, so in this very first section, there are two showcases that are quite important in giving this context that I've just spoken about. And the first relates to her early life. And we've really benefited from having very comprehensive access to some materials from the Shanghai Library as well as the former residence of Zhang Jingjiang. These materials are reflected in these showcases here. Now, Zhang Jingjiang, of course, is Georgette Chen's father, and he's a very well-known political figure as well as a person who was influential in the campaigns of the revolutionary Sun Yat-sen. He was an important financial backer as well as a supporter of the kind of revolutionary effort. And of course, he was related to Eugene Chen, which is how the two knew each other. Sung Qingling, which is a name that I think is familiar to many, was the wife of Sun Yat-sen, and she indeed was the one who introduced Eugene Chen to Georgette Chen. So in this showcase, we can see some photographs that relate to the close relationship between the Zhangs as well as Eugene Chen, as well as some context that reveals this kind of very important political period and how it related to the family as a whole. And we see here a very rare and beautiful picture of the 5 daughters of the Chang family as they were known, and it's called The 5 Flowers in Paris. It's dated probably around the early 1910s because you can guess at this based on the age of the girls. Chen was often featured in the news media, and this is something that we kind of covered in the earlier gallery when we spoke about how she appeared often with her exhibitions publicized and reviewed in the newspapers. But it's interesting to see how even from a very early age, this was something that was happening very often. So here you can actually see that she's pictured in a kind of pictorial supplement, age 20. And she's about to embark on studies in France and then subsequently the United States. And also she appeared on the cover of a magazine called The Young Companion, or Liang You in Chinese. And this is an interesting kind of periodical for her to appear in because it was known as a magazine that was targeted at the so-called the modern girl, or the modern woman. And Chen being on this cover was really emblematic of her status as a person who was really engaged in a professional work and perhaps in a very globe-trotting-like manner. And one thing to note that whenever she appeared in these periodicals, in part because of her relationship towards with her father, as well as her husband Eugene Chen, she was always described as an artist or described in relation to her art practice. Okay, so here we see a selection of works from Chen's earlier period. There are not many of these in our national collection. I think that we are well represented in terms of the works from the Nanyang period, which is seen in the earlier galleries. But in terms of these works from the 30s, there are fewer of them. So we've tried to rely on archival materials to really supplement the story that we want to tell about Chen's period. But this is a very important work that Chen made. Also, it's not really widely shown, so we're glad to present it here. It's called The Coast of Brittany, and it's dated around 1930. And it's unique because it's one of the perhaps only works that we have that we see evidence of her painting with a palette knife. Now, using a palette knife was really characteristic of the kind of post-impressionistic techniques that she was trained in when she was in France. And when you go up close and you really see the textures and the thick application of paint, which is what we call like an impasto effect, you can see that it's quite different from the smoother strokes that you've witnessed in the works that she made in Malaysia as well as Singapore. Now, the Brittany was a very popular place for artists to work in. It was a well-known tourist destination because there was a direct train line from Paris, but at the same time it was known as a kind of like a haven for painters. And people like Gauguin or painters from the Barbizon school were very well known for making a lot of works there. And one thing that Chen always enjoyed doing, and she started doing this very early, was painting on plein air, which means outdoors, which meant that she would set up her easel and just work in the open and really capture the vagaries of the scene around her. So you can see this in the smoke that's rising from the chimneys, as well as a sense of kind of like a life passing by, before your eyes. And she was always drawn to scenes where you can see both the kind of like land as well as the sea. And this is a fine example of this in the very early days. And of course, you can see that when she came to Malaysia and Singapore, she continued doing this by painting scenes of the Singapore River or the coastline. Okay, so here is a very fine and sweet still life with a cut apple and orange. with a rather unique bamboo frame. We don't really have many of her works framed in such a manner, so I think that this really kind of helps to draw in the eye towards the subject matter depicted therein. I mentioned before that she was really influenced by the post-impressionist style, and we see this again here because this kind of approach was really used by Cézanne, in which the composition is framed in a very tight way and almost like looking down from above. If you remember what we just saw before, in which the boats are kind of seen from above, it's kind of interesting that her boats look like her oranges as well, just because of the way they're foreshortened and shaped. And it's a really kind of like still scene, but the sense of liveliness in it as well, because it's almost as if like she has just kind of like cut the fruit and just left it there and it's waiting for something to kind of happen. So the way that it's been rendered and the composition is really quite interesting and really shows her foundational training, how much she was influenced by it. Okay, here we have the second substantial showcase that sheds light upon Chen's training in Paris. Now, she went to France in 1927 to start her training at the Académie Colarossi as well as the Académie Biloul. Now, these were two private academies in which she trained and learned the foundational aspects of painting, perspective, composition, drawing, and so forth. And we know a little bit about her period because of her own accounts that she gave in various interviews, as well as this very interesting letter that is actually dated 1953, but it works in this showcase because it's a transcription of an interview that she gave to Radio Malaya, in which she went into detail about the kinds of things that she did while she was studying in Paris. So she spoke about how she studied classical training at the academy, but also attended what she calls the freer studios, where she painted or actually drew and sketched figures, like live figures, and learned about anatomy and so forth. And I think that this foundational training is really how she managed to kind of like really develop her skills and paint so many beautiful and very lively and striking portraits throughout her entire life and practice. Now, I mentioned earlier that we don't really have a lot of paintings from her this early period, but one thing that we found that's very interesting is that we have now access through the Shanghai Library of some works that she made during this time but are now no longer traceable. So these include a nude that was published in a newspaper article, as well as a still life of some flowers and a landscape that were also published in a magazine. So of course it was quite common around this time for people who were kind of like newsmakers like Georgette to have their work publicized in these kind of newspapers and magazines. Unfortunately, it's not in color, but they remain very interesting relics of something that is now no longer with us. Another interesting work is actually a clipping that resides in our own library and archive collection. It was published in 1936, but the painting itself could have been made a little bit earlier. It's called Danseuse, or The Dancer. And if you had a look at this painting, I think that you'd be quite surprised because it looks quite different from the kind of portraits or figures that Georgette was known to paint later on. So this figure is kind of a dancer who's posed in a rather contrived fashion, and the folds of her skirt as well as the kind of screen that is behind her, they look very angular and strong in terms of their lines. And it remains a very kind of tantalizing example of some of Georgette's early works. Also here we see a very interesting little diary or daybook. It's dated from 1935, and as we had mentioned before, due to the fact that the estate has left the National Gallery a lot of Chen's paintings as well as personal effects, this diary survives with us. It's extremely small and it's written in very cursive handwriting, which makes it quite hard to read. And it's interesting to see how Chen started off using this kind of very characteristic brown fountain pen ink that she will continue to use throughout the rest of her life. Now, what we've done here is to open it at 2 pages around August, in which she describes how she went to Aix-en-Provence, which is kind of like the known to be the home of Cézanne, which I just spoke about just now. And indeed, she went there because she wanted to kind of look at the landscapes that Cézanne made, particularly like some very famous rocks and mountainous scenes, and try to paint them as well. And what she did while she was there was also visit some kind of like local places of interest that were related to art, such as the Aix kind of cathedral that had some well-known tapestries and paintings there. So you can see that throughout her life, she made it part of a practice to basically tour to different parts of countries that she was located in, and always find new landscapes to paint and just find these fresh scenes to depict, not just in Paris, but of course when she was in Malaysia as well, as you've heard from Hui Min. So here you see some sketches, our works on pencil by Georgette Chen, and they're quite rare in our collection because we just don't have that many of them that have survived. And it's interesting because Chen was a person who, in her personal philosophy as well as the way she taught her students, always emphasized the importance of drawing. So she said this again and again when she was teaching, as well as in her annual addresses to the NAFA graduates. And here, of course, are examples of these drawings. There's one of Eugene Chen there, that's quite early, it's 1932. But these are interesting as well because there are 3 nude sketches out of a total of 5 that we have, and we selected them to put them here. They were part of a classical training and approach that is called croquis, which means like you look at this live figure in front of you and you just do a quick sketch. So what is important is not so much the detail of the figure, but more their attitude and their pose. And here you can see a variety of positions, including the nude being seated or reclining or standing from and view from behind. So these are very kind of like lively and illuminating examples of Chen's approach in terms of like her drawing techniques. Okay, here is a nude woman, which is dated 1932. We're very excited to have this work because it's a new acquisition which came to gallery quite recently. And it's quite a rare subject matter for Chen because there are not many works that she has that have this subject matter. And in fact, it's the only one that remains in a public collection. So this particular work really reflects again the background that Chen kind of came up in with regards to her academic training. The academy that she studied in, called Academy Colarossi, was known to be quite a progressive and liberal one. There were many students from overseas, so she was one of several, and she really made her acquaintance with a variety of artists. At the same time, it allowed women to sketch nude figures. This wasn't always so common, especially in kind of like before the 1900s, but Academy Colarossi started out by allowing women to sketch nude figures, and this was very important, of course, for artists to fully understand the figure and really how limbs and the body is articulated. And this is probably earlier work for Chen because of the way that the figure is composed and rendered. You can see once again, similar to the coast of Brittany, that there's many layers of thick impasto or layers of paint. She did not use a palette knife, but rather round brushes, and the strokes are very, very pronounced. And she uses the play of light to kind of play off parts of the figure that are raised, such as the model's chest or her knees and the kind of like angles of her hand and so forth. And we can kind of discern from this painting that the more important thing for Chen in making this work was actually the body of the woman, not so much her kind of like her as a character in this painting, because her face is quite obscured, and in fact it's a little bit foreshortened and shrunken, and the focus is really on this kind of pyramidal structure that she did explore in some of her early portraits. And so the way that the background is done and how it melts with the fabric that lays over this model's lap is also quite interesting. So as a kind of new acquisition and a rare subject, we're very excited to show this piece in this exhibition.
So in this section, we'll look at Chen's production of artworks and her artistic practice during the war. Chen described the period between 1941 and 1945 as the dark days of Japanese occupation. She and her first husband, Eugene Chen, were placed under limited surveillance by the Japanese forces. The Japanese forces respected Eugene Chen for his international repute as the diplomat with iron-fisted hands. He actually managed to wrest sovereignty of Zhejiang and Hankou from the British forces in the 1920s. Necessarily limited to the home, Chen's subject matters was confined to ordinary everyday objects and her first husband, Eugene Chen. So here in this section, we have 3 portraits of Eugene Chen, and let's take a closer look at one of them. Here, Chen uses dark muted grey tones to kind of depict Eugene Chen's pensiveness and also his worry about China's fate. And you can see Eugene Chen here with his glasses off and also with his hands to his cheeks, kind of thinking, perhaps thinking about what he can do to contribute or to help China in these worrying times. And in this section, you see a display of artworks that kind of showcases and depicts everyday objects from phoenix eyes and even to vegetables and melons and clay pots as well. So these would have been objects that Chen would have found in her home and also in her everyday life as well. Here in this artwork, you see vegetables and melons that are kind of propped against a wall, and you can see the complex interplay of shadows that she depicts and also how she adopts the top-down perspective to display the artworks.
Continuing from elevating the everyday, this painting, Hakka family, painted in 1939, is the biggest painting and biggest canvas that Chen completed during this period in her life. You see before you a sort of close family unit composing a mother as well as her 3 children. It takes on the compositional approach common to European-style paintings, often depicting Mother Mary and Jesus. But here we see an ordinary Hakka family, and we know they are sort of everyday people based on the different props that Chen has also decided to include in this painting. You can see a farmer's hat leaning against the wall, as well as a stick that is used in farming. The mother and children are composed in triangular format, drawing our attention to the sort of close relationship between the 3. This painting was one that Chen took particular pride in. Following its completion in 1939, while Chen was in Hong Kong, she subsequently included this painting in every single one of her solo exhibitions and always listed it as number 1 in her exhibition catalogue. We're very excited to be able to share this painting with our visitors, as previously, the only time that this painting has been published has always been in black and white and in newspapers. So for the first time, we're very excited to be showing visitors this painting in full color, and it will also be published in color in our exhibition catalogue. So in the same way that Chen approached painting still lifes and people from the everyday, she too took a very grounded approach to expressing the landscapes of the different places that she was fortunate to travel within. This section looks at her treatment of landscapes, as well as the different trips that she took around China, including Beijing, Suzhou, as well as Hong Kong. Let's take a closer look at one of the paintings. This painting of harbour scene in Hong Kong is composed in a very unique square format. You can see here Chen incorporating different perspectives into a single painting. You might notice in the foreground, you kind of get a sense that you're sitting on top of a hill, looking down on a scene, watching labourers and everyday people go about their daily tasks. But when you take a step back and look at the painting, you're also afforded a very long view into the distance. So we see here again Chen being very adept at combining different perspectives into a single scene. When you look at these things in sort of the individual components, it might give you the sense that the painting and the perspective is a little bit off kilter. But eventually what Chen is able to do is, through her use of color as well as very sensitive treatment of the different objects in the painting, bring it together in a sense of harmony and also sort of visual symmetry. These 3 paintings behind me were painted by Chen during a trip that she took following World War II. After the death of her husband, Eugene Chen, Chen took a trip by herself, traveling to places in China, such as Suzhou, Hangzhou, Beijing, and Jiaxing. The paintings behind me depict one particular site, the Forbidden City in Beijing. This particular work is on loan to us from the Fukuoka Asian Art Museum, and it presents quite a monumental view of the Forbidden City. You can see the meandering moat that leads our eyes further into the painting and appreciate Chen's masterful use of perspective. Even as we appreciate the grandeur of this building, we also get a sense that this is a building that is in a little disrepair. We can see how Chen has shown some of the paint flaking off the distinctive red brick exterior of the palace. It then becomes interesting to consider the time in which Chen made this painting. Following multiple revolutions and with China on the cusp of a new political regime, it's also interesting to consider Chen's place within this historical context. This archival showcase focuses on Chen's life just during and also, most importantly, after the war. So significantly, during this difficult period, Chen was still able to exhibit her works. She was included in an exhibition at the Shanghai Metropole in 1943, and after the war, very impressively went on to stage 3 exhibitions, one in 1947 at the Alliance Francaise in Shanghai, in 1949 at the Asia Institute in New York, and in 1950 at the Galerie Lalecon in Paris. So a lot of the works that we've just seen, including the landscapes, still lifes, as well as portraits, were all included in these exhibitions. So now it brings us to the question, with Chen receiving so much professional success, why did she decide to move to Penang and eventually Singapore? We get a sort of sense of how she was thinking and struggling through this difficult period when she was living alternately in America as well as France. She wrote frequent letters to her friend Sung Ching Ling, who was also married to Dr. Sun Yat-sen, asking Sung Ching Ling, is there any chance of employment for myself and my second husband, Ho Yang-chi? This letter, dated to 11th of March 1951, was the last letter that Chen wrote to Sung Ching Ling while she was still in France, asking for advice on how she could return to China. Sung Ching Ling never replied, and eventually the next letter that Chen wrote to Sung Ching Ling was when she was already in Penang, telling her about her new life and job opportunities that she had decided to move there for. So this is where we'd like to end the exhibition, meditating on an early self-portrait by Chen, painted in 1934. As we've gone through the exhibition, we understand this as a very exciting period in Chen's life, when she had just completed her training in art schools, when she had just married Eugene Chen, her first husband, when she was just starting to be accepted into international salons and major international exhibitions. We see here in her expression sense of ambiguity, but also strength and determination, full of promise as a young artist, really trying to think about what her place is in the world.